Greetings. My name is John Duvall. Welcome to another Truth Factor discussion. Today is August the 24th. The year is 2016, and the time is just a couple of minutes after 11 o'clock Central Time. That's enough about me. How are you all doing, gentlemen? Brian, let's start with you.
Doing great. Ready for our study today.
Super, super. Eric, you off to a good start?
Yes, it is a beautiful day here.
A lot of out-of-this-world thoughts you might have on a day like today.
Woo!
Mike, how goes it?
Fantastic. Fantastic. Ready to go for the study.
Super. Tom, how about you out there in the California?
As with everybody else, doing well. Doing well. Looking forward to the another hour of study.
All right. And Paul, you doing all right?
Doing great. Having a good day, and just glad to be able to study together for a little while.
Sounds good. And way down there in beautiful Florida. How about you, Wayne?
I'm doing all right. I'm looking forward to our study today as well.
Two quick questions. Tom, do we have any current updates to the fires down there south of you?
Well, yeah.
As far as brethren, or?
Well, as far as brethren, the big fire that we talked about last week in San Bernardino is 100% out or contained.
Okay.
As far as I understand, no brethren lost homes. Even though some had their homes threatened, but if you hear on the news and look on maps, there's just a lot of other fires. There's one close to Santa Barbara right now, which is about 100 miles west of Los Angeles. So there's several fires. It's a big concern. Even more so, I think I'm more concerned about what's happening in Louisiana right now with brethren. So.
Yeah, I was going to mention that next. We've had some private discussions. There is a lot of prayers needed for the folks down in Louisiana. What I understand, in one particular city, there's a congregation. Some of the members have been affected by that. Several of the members have been affected. So just kind of keep, for those who faithfully follow the Lord, keep them in your minds and your prayers. Definitely difficult times. All right, let's see. Let's go ahead and get our study underway today. We had left off last week in our study looking at 1 Peter. We have finished up chapter 3, and now we're about to enter into a study of chapter 4, 1 Peter chapter 4. Any thoughts or comments before we actually step into that area of the study?
John,
as far as what we've already talked about?
I was just going to mention that also to keep, many of you know the Edwards family, Johnny Edwards, Johnny Paul, John Isaac, that two of the young ladies in that family were in a terrible accident down in Cozumel, Mexico, and one of the daughters was killed, and the other one is injured, and the family is trying to get to them. It's Johnny Paul and Melba's daughters. Adrio did not survive the accident, and Becca has an injury, broken arm, I believe, in multiple places. They're supposed to do surgery today. John and Melba are trying to get there. For those of you who know the extended family, this will be John and Isaac's sisters, Johnny Edwards' granddaughters.
Wow. Yeah, I read that. That's tragic. It's tragic.
Very, very tragic, yes.
Yeah, definitely keep them in your minds and your prayers. You plan to go away for a short little vacation, and you really don't know what's going to happen.
And just for a point of reference, I'm going to go ahead and say, in case someone's watching this at a later date, that today is August
24th.
24th, thank you, 2016, so that this doesn't get repeated and someone thinks someone else was hurt or something, but August 24th, 2016 is the date of this broadcast. The accident was yesterday.
Okay, all right. Well, I appreciate you mentioning that, Paul. That way they can kind of mentally timestamp it when they hear it and know the details on it. Okay. Well, let's go ahead and get our study underway. Why don't we go ahead and, in 1 Peter chapter 4, read the first 6 verses from that text. And let's say, Tom, would you mind doing that reading for us?
Sure. 1 through 6. 1 Peter chapter 4, and I will be reading out of the New King James Version.
All right, I've got it up on my screen, Tom.
Okay, all right. Therefore, since Christ suffered for us in the flesh, arm yourselves also with the same mind. For he who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin, that he no longer should live the rest of his time in the flesh for the lust of men, but for the will of God. For we have spent enough of our past lifetime in doing the will of the Gentiles, when we walked in lewdness, lust, drunkenness, revelries, drinking parties, and abominable idolatries. In regard to these, they think it strange that you do not run with them in the same flood of dissipation, speaking evil of you. They will give an account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead. For this reason, the gospel was preached also to those who are dead, that they might be judged according to men in the flesh, but live according to God in the Spirit.
All righty, thank you. Thank you, Tom. I appreciate that. All right, so let's go ahead and look back up to verse 1. He's still talking about suffering, as he's already, we've looked at extensively. It's going back to chapter 2 and on into chapter 3, various instances wherein we may suffer as Christians, suffer as a result of our faith in God and so forth. And, of course, we talked about Jesus as being the perfect example for that suffering there. But he says, kind of building on that, you've got as it's worded in the New King James translation, and the English Standard Version is very similar, therefore, or since, therefore, Christ has suffered for us in the flesh. He tells us essentially to ready ourselves so that we are of the same mind, for he who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin. Do you think that there is a strong connection with the ultimate cause for the suffering seen within the statement, for he who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin? What are your thoughts on that?
Ask that question one more time, John. I'm sorry, I didn't quite understand.
You said the ultimate cause of suffering.
Well, yeah, the suffering within the context that we've been looking at, 2, 3, and 4, or chapters 2 and 3. What my question is, if when he says, for he who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin, if that is really helping to identify ultimately the source or the why one may suffer as a Christian, because they have ceased from sin.
Oh, okay.
I think
I was
there's
looking at it differently, but that's an interesting observation.
I guess there's a certain irony in the fact that, on the one hand, the reason suffering exists is because of sin, but on the other hand, the way we escape sin is through suffering. And in this case, not through suffering for wrongdoing, which Peter mentioned several times, don't do that part,
Right.
But rather through imitating the suffering of Jesus, who suffered without committing sin. So you have that aspect. We can't ignore, again, chapter division might try to trick us, but we can't ignore the connection with 3:18. Christ died for sins once for all, the just for the unjust. In other words, and he was put to death in the flesh, made alive in the spirit. Then you get to 4:1. Since Christ suffered in the flesh, same expression, arm yourselves also with the same purpose, because he who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin. So there again, we might be living in a realm where the flesh is prevailing and causing us to suffer, but in reality, God will vindicate his people in the spirit, just as he vindicated Jesus. So.
But we're suffering because we've chosen this lifestyle whereby we have walked away from sin, and therefore we are set in opposition to those who would choose to follow sin.
Does the ESV render verse 1, he suffered for us in the flesh, or he suffered in the flesh?
Christ suffered in the flesh.
Okay, so the New King James and the King James render this, he suffered for us in the flesh. And to me, that us in the flesh would put more of the suffering further on, referencing Christ's suffering for us versus our own suffering because we've abstained from sin. So I would wonder there if the distinction in those two ways of rendering that might
be a textual variant. The New American Standard doesn't have for us either.
I see that.
I'm looking around right now trying to. Oh, hold on one moment. I'll find my address.
Because as you're saying, John, I would see it more what you're saying in verse 1. If it just says he suffered in the flesh, and then it would contrast with our suffering. But then if it's he suffered for us in the flesh, I would say that the suffering for the next part of the verse would be his suffering so that we should abstain from sin.
Okay, chapter 4,
Okay.
verse 1. He suffered for us is a variant reading found in a couple of different manuscripts. Alexandrinus, looks like the second hand on Sinaiticus, and the Textus Receptus, which would put it in the King James and the New King James.
Yeah, I've seen that.
The reading that does not say for us is attested in Papyrus 72, which is pretty old, Vaticanus, Ephrematicus, a bunch of other stuff.
So split about down the middle.
So, I mean, the consensus is, the ESV and the NASB probably has it right. Yeah.
The Sinaiticus had us in it?
The second hand on Sinaiticus had it. It's, this Aleph too. There's a lot of weird stuff with Sinaiticus in terms of, somebody erasing part of it and copying over it.
Okay. Yeah. Well, and I may be looking at this a little bit wonky within the context now that I kind of look at it a little bit differently in what you were saying, Brian, because really the point he seems to be making is because Christ suffered for us, then we need to cease from sin, so as to live the rest of the time in the flesh no longer for the lust of men. So the suffering that was went through so that we might be able to cease from sin. Arm yourself also with the same purpose, because he who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin. Okay, Brian, do you think that he who has suffered in the flesh could still be talking about Christ, and Christ ceased from sin? Therefore, we arm ourselves with that thought?
Well, it could be. Like I said, I think that I think it could be either way, of course. But when I look at this, I think that he is probably still us. But again, the idea of suffering in the flesh, he did it for us, so that in effect we suffered in the flesh through him. Would be what I originally thought he was saying, so that we should no longer live in sin.
Yeah, and Jesus never ceased from sin because he never.
That's
sinned.
right. That's right.
Okay.
Yeah, apparently it could mean he finished dealing with sin, but I don't know. I think both things are true. So
he ceased from sin or dealing with sin. That's an interesting thought. I mean, we might have kind of this double meaning. There's a sense in which, of course, when Christ is living his earthly life, he's faced with temptations. These things are set before him. And then, when he's put to death in the flesh, he didn't yield to temptation. He said, not going to deal with this. He, in that sense, even though he had never sinned, you might say he had ceased from sin. I'm done with sin.
Yeah.
And now that he's done with sin, we too have the opportunity to be done with sin. If we're willing to suffer according to the flesh and follow in the footsteps of Christ. So
that way of being done with sin.
Yeah.
Maybe a thought here that what he's describing is
it's a weird way to say it.
As we suffer, we're willing to be faithful even though there is suffering involved with that, and we're willing to do that. There's also the idea that in other passages that when we suffer, it has a purifying effect. The baptism of fire, so to speak. When we're willing to be strong enough that we are willing to face suffering, even face faithfulness, even though there is suffering involved, that there is that it really proves the sincerity, the truth of our character as we serve God. And so we have to be willing to do that.
I don't know if this would be a good comparison, Paul, but that kind of reminds me a little bit of what the Apostle Paul was saying in 1 Corinthians 3 about those would come upon and building on what Paul had, building upon the congregation there, people that they would teach would be tested, and some would survive and some would not.
Yeah, I think that's sort of what I'm seeing here. Jesus was the ultimate purity there, and I think he's just saying in the first part of that verse, he sets the example for us of being faithful in all things. Then when we're faithful, it shows the purity, the trueness, the genuineness of our character.
Interesting. Okay. Of course, the ultimate point is, as verse 2 says, so that we no longer live our lifetime for the lust of men, but for the will of God. That cleansing there. Any thoughts or any comments? Mike, you got any words?
No, I'm contemplating some things that I believe will come to a head at verse 2, but right now I'm finding this fascinating.
Yeah, one thing that came to my mind, I was wondering from the standpoint of if he's making the point when we are living the way that we ought to, because those who desire to live godly will suffer persecutions. Could you have the idea of somebody who is standing for that which is right, and in so doing not sinning, not lying, not compromising, not doing something to that effect, not refusing to defend the truth when you ought to defend the truth, those types of things, which sometimes will result in persecutions. And suffering, suffering as a result of those times when you cease from sin. You stop sinning, you're a Christian, you're living your life as a Christian, and because you're doing it properly, it causes the world to despise you even more and makes you more susceptible to suffering as a Christian.
Well, that's
of course,
that's a direct connect with verse 4. And all this, they're surprised that you do not run with them to the same excess of dissipation, and they malign you, in the New American Standard Translation.
Yeah, and you also have up in the verse number 3, or chapter 3, the do not think it strange that you are suffering. Let's see, where was that at? Anyway, so I mean, that's just actually, when I look at verse 2 and put it in there, it seems to be when he says that he should no longer live the rest of his life in the flesh, it seems to be pointing more toward this as somebody who is resolved to stop sinning, and somehow the suffering is helping him to do that. I could always see somebody who is also stubborn in refusing to yield to sins in the face of persecution. In other words, as he suffers for the cause of Christ, rather than causing him to cower, rather than causing him to back off, it causes him to dig in.
Okay, all right. I mean, repentance is our ceasing from sin. I mean,
absolutely. Yeah, exactly.
All right. Any other thoughts?
The whole point is is Christians are going to suffer, and when you suffer, God knows what you're going through, and ultimately, in the end, ultimately, in the end, you will be rewarded if you remain faithful and stand fast.
Yeah. I may look at verse 1 a little bit differently now, after we've had some discussion on this, because the remainder of 1 through 5 is basically telling us, because of this, we are to no longer live the rest of our lifetime fulfilling the lust of the flesh. In other words, we cease to sin. And so it could be there, as was suggested a while ago, that when he says, because he who has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin, or has put an end to sin, because of his death. Therefore, we need to keep that in mind and not live with sin within our life. Interesting. Okay.
One of my favorite allegorical events in the Bible is around the man Barabbas. And when we consider Barabbas, who was apparently going to die, and perhaps even die at the same time the other two men on the cross were going to die, that with Jesus dying on the cross, it relieves Barabbas of his crime, so to speak. And so Barabbas, in my imagination, I see Barabbas set free that day, and Barabbas goes forth cleansed because of the suffering of Christ, so to speak, and he's set free. And he has the choice, do I go back into my crimes and then, again, ultimately experience this penalty, or do I go forth as a free man? In fact, the very name Barabbas, Bar Abba, the son of the Father, is clearly a subtle reference for us to consider of our own adoption into God, into the family of God. So I really like to think of that man in this verse.
His name is Son of the Father? I never knew that.
Yeah, no, that's what that means.
Does that be like a nickname, or is that somebody's name?
That's a huge subject of debate, which nobody has an answer to.
Let's debate it.
But you have to consider that the story of Barabbas is in every gospel. All 4 gospels dedicate a good part of their crucifixions references to Barabbas' life, and I think that the significance there is he stands in for us, so to speak. That he represents us.
Okay.
Interesting. It's almost like almost like Jesus went in his place or something.
Well, you know what? So you think about that. Truly, though, Wayne, you think about that, and the idea it maybe isn't saying that he died for Barabbas, charged with Barabbas' crime, but he did because his titulus is different. But his place does remove his crime.
No, I agree. You're right about all that. That's and yet for some reason nobody thinks that that because Barabbas has been taken off the hook that he was somehow exempt from all future infarctions.
Yeah. That's
interesting. Right. But I digress.
All right, Paul, let's bring in Ken Seal's comments from the chat room, if you would.
Sure. Let me pull that up here. Ken says, I'm persuaded the context from verse 2 is helpful that the suffering was with the mindset. I no longer live to sin, so he suffered to overcome, and once overcome, the temptations lose their power as the metal of his character is now been spiritually tempered.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Well, one more thought on that, and Ken kind of made me think about this, and kind of goes back to what Tom was talking about. And the problem with suffering resulting in a cessation of sin or a stopping of sin is that when an individual becomes a child of God, that repentance they're supposed to make the decision to walk away from sin. And there's no suffering there that they would face when they first become a Christian to make them stronger so they can finally and eventually cease from sin. We're supposed to stop the sin as soon as we are baptized into Christ. But I can see, though, where suffering as a Christian would strengthen us or could strengthen us, though.
Well, John, I think your point there is that's where I was wanting to go with verses 2 and 3, if I may.
Okay.
The fact that we've been baptized cleanses us from all sin, but baptism, being a Christian, does not take away the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life. Those 3 elements are what leads to sin. They're always present everywhere we go. They are constants.
Right.
Our suffering is in the resisting of those things because the flesh obviously about the things that he would, those he does not, would not do, those are the things he does. It's a constant lust of the eyes and the pride of life. So when you get to verse 3, having determined now that your life is going to be according to the will of God, Peter says the time past of our life may suffice us to have wrought the will of the Gentiles. What you've done in your past is enough. You've got the memory of it. Thank goodness God has forgiven and forgotten. But one of the reasons man remembers his sins of the past is so he won't be stupid enough to do it twice. I've said it for years that a scar leaves evidence of a problem that's been healed, but a constant reminder of the pain that it caused. And I think that's the way with sin. It's a constant reminder of what we should not have done, why we allowed our Lord to heal that in obedience to the gospel, and why we don't want to go through that pain again. The suffering is fighting against all these lusts and these desires. We can't go out and do as we used to do. We can't do as many of our peers would have us do. That's why verse 4, they think we're odd, that we won't go with them to the same excess of riot. They speak evil of us because they won't accept the truth we did accept. They're not willing to make that mind change and that life change.
All right. Okay. Any thoughts or comments about that? It does remind me a little bit, Mike, of Colossians chapter 3, when he tells them to put to death like sexual immorality, purity, etc. But then he says in verse 7, "In these you too once walked when you were living in them, but now you must put them all away, anger, wrath, etc." So this was behavior present within the lives before they became Christians, but even becoming a Christian requires us to continue to put stuff away.
Add to that the fact of Moses.
Who?
Moses, according to, I believe, is Paul, but you can believe what you want, the Apostle Paul, but you can believe what you want. The Hebrew writer talks about Moses and how he chose to suffer affliction with the children of God rather to enjoy pleasures of sin, but only to the flesh, only to the eyes, only to the pride of life. Sin can't please God. You either want to satisfy the flesh or do you want to satisfy God? Satisfying the flesh will get you through this life, but it won't get you. Satisfying God will also get you through this life and into heaven. There's the choice.
All right. Good point. Good point. All right. Any thoughts about verse 3? Let's go and kind of move on to verse 3 and 4. I mean, it seems like an obvious just reminder of what you used to do, making the connection, in this case in point, Gentiles being those who are outside of the body of Christ, and those individuals pursuing the course of sensuality, lust, drunkenness, carousing, drinking parties, and abominable idolatries, New American Standard Version. As Mike said, that's in the past. That's what you did back then. And now you have no longer engaged in these things. We want to talk about any of those things he lists there in verse 3.
A couple of quick observations about the setup to it.
Sure.
Peter's continuing at least it appears to me, he's continuing the use of Israel in a spiritual sense that we saw in chapter 1 as he addresses them as exiles and all that, because here he contrasts that with the Gentiles. And so, that's interesting. Gentiles equals sinners here in this context. Of course, he's referring to the pagan practices of the people around him. But also, it's interesting that I think his phrase, I don't know what the right word for it is. It's but when he says the time that has passed suffices, of course, there's no required amount of time to spend in any of that. So it's a sort of a figure of speech of some sort, but I don't know what the right term would be for it. But it's an interesting one that he chooses.
Yeah, it's like you've done that enough. It's time to do something else now.
Right.
Yeah.
Enough of that. We talk that way in English. You've had enough of this. It's time to do something else. It's time to stop that.
However much time. If it was only 5 minutes, that would be enough.
Well, I tell my children, if they're doing something that I don't want them doing, I say that's enough, which doesn't imply that they were supposed to be doing it and they've done it enough. It implies that they weren't supposed to be doing it in the first place, and you're going to stop now, or else.
We've got a comment from Ken. I jumped a little bit too soon into verse 3. Let's read Ken's comment from the chat room real quick, Paul, and then I'll make a thought about verse 3 real quick, and then we can continue on with this.
Okay. Peter is speaking of those who have suffered in the flesh. They know their mission and the will of God, so they suffer, struggle, resist, and overcome temptations. It's the least we can do, as our Master suffered for us to save us.
Yeah, that's a good point. Good point. An interesting thought that occurred to me with verse 3, for the time that has passed suffices, in conjunction with what y'all were talking about. When they allow themselves to engage in this behavior, they learned what the behavior was about. They experienced that behavior. They saw the detrimental effects of that behavior. And then fundamentally, when becoming a Christian, they saw the folly of that behavior. Maybe that's another way of looking at it. What y'all have been suggesting, I think, is right up there with that. That you spent long enough in it to know that it's something you shouldn't be doing. Maybe, might be stretching it just a little bit there with his thoughts. Why is there a lot of hesitancy in? Well, what do you think about drinking parties? How about that?
Hot sauce. Wow, here you go.
Yeah, I've just served, and so y'all.
I don't recommend going to them.
It is interesting. He mentions drunkenness, and then he mentions drinking parties.
He mentions revelries.
Can we just point out that in the context, the verse 4 summarizes everything in verse 3 as a phrase, this same flood of debauchery, as the ESV puts it. So he's describing a wanton, reckless, sinful lifestyle. And when you just read verse 3, it sounds like a frat party. It sounds like, that kind of lifestyle that's so typical of the partying ways of the world, and that's not to be part of the life of a Christian.
What I like is he uses the expression, you're running with them. It doesn't even mean you're doing it. You're just, a part of their doing it.
Yeah. That's a good point.
From BDAG, I like this description here. In the Greco-Roman world, it was customary for literati to hold banquets at which topical discussions were featured, with participants well lubricated with wine. These would not properly be rendered carousals. It is probable that the Petrine passage has less sophisticated participants in mind.
Yeah. So polite.
Well lubricated.
And the word for that is symposium.
Symposium?
That's the Greek word for a drinking party.
Where you see that? Hold on, I'm looking.
No, that's the archaic Greek word, not the scriptural word.
Oh, yeah, I was like, okay, that's where I'm thrown off.
Well, I think Eric, when he used a reference like a frat party at college level, I mean, that's, take it back during this time period, they're worshiping false gods. Nowadays, they're worshiping a football team that won a victory or something. But that's a good point. It's excess, out of control, doing things that are sinful.
Yeah, I mean, essentially.
And those, it's my experience from, I never went to college except for a few classes that I decided to take. But it's come to my attention through talking with others that such parties are known to be evil because the college does not promote that kind of thing. They generally come down pretty hard on those places that go so riotous, even to the point that they'll take away their charter in the frats. That's happened in Bloomington lots of times. It needs to happen more, quite frankly, in my opinion. But the idea here is that people know what's wrong, and yet they do it anyway. Romans chapter 1, they not only do the same, but take pleasure in them that do them. It's a promoted evil. The Christian determines he's not having any part of that. You go to Ephesians, and they're not even going to be seen with those that participate in things that are wrong to be spoken of, even in private. We have a different lifestyle. We look at other religions dress differently, their culture's different, they're more primitive in their things. And sometimes we make awfully destructive fun, is the only way I can think of it, of those kind of things. But if we were careful to examine it, at least in the moralistic views of those things, I don't know how I can condemn some of that. They are serious about keeping themselves pure. That's the job of the Christian.
Yeah.
He's just simply not to be in that kind of a category or where that can even be rubbed off on him. Paul had a reason for saying that evil manners, you just don't associate with.
And to add what you said there, Mike, when you hit that Romans 1 verse, he says there at the end that the penalty applies to whether they do it or whether they approve of those who do it. And I think that's
correct.
Here is that he's saying, you know, you don't run with them. It doesn't necessarily imply that you have to be doing it with them, but you're with them as they do it. You're not even with them anymore. Would be going back to what you say.
Yeah.
You're known by, even the Lord said that you're known by the company you keep. Well, why would a Christian want to keep company with those people notorious for doing things against God? Now, there's kind of a conundrum with this, because as Christians, who's obligated to teach the heathen? And how can you teach the heathen and not have some sort of association with him? I can do that provided people are going to see what we're doing and not question it as being evil.
But
if the evil person isn't willing to do that, if they're not willing to do that, then I don't know how I can much study with them.
Yeah.
Go ahead, John.
Well, I was going to say, you think about Jesus, he was maligned because of who he ate with. The thing is, when he ate with them, they weren't engaging in sinful behavior. You know, you can have friends that go to a frat party and they maybe get drunk, but you're not there with them at the time that they do that. You don't condone what they're doing or even excuse it. I think the only time you'd have a Christian in that scene, in effect, goes back to verse 2. We're not supposed to be living any longer, reading from the ESV, the rest of the time in the flesh, no longer for human passions, but for the will of God. When we begin to live for human passions, then we engage in these things. But when we seek the will of God, we don't.
Yeah.
And sometimes there's some judgment required, because if you look at what goes on in a typical SEC college football game, it would look a lot like a frat party. In fact, it's the same people that are there. Some of them have graduated, moved on, but they return to their college partying day roots when it's game day. And maybe someone would look at that and say, you know what, I don't want to be around that. I don't want my kids around. I'm not going. Somebody else might say, well, I'm going to go, but that's not why I'm going, and I'm not going to participate. And so some of these things require some judgment on our part.
Yeah.
There's a lot of, I mean, you know, there's a lot of the wisdom type discussion that is going on that is important to factor in all of this.
Yeah.
I mean, the fact is, you know, what we have in verse 4, they're surprised at your behavior. They're surprised that for some reason you don't want to participate. You don't want to run with them into this. You don't want to join them in their excesses, their dissipations. They're actually maligning you for your behavior. You know, if the justification for engaging in an activity is, well, I don't want people to, you know, I don't want people to think I'm uncool, or I don't want people to think I'm not hip, or whatever, that's not enough. They'll malign you, and they'll be surprised at you. You know, now you can have all kinds of other discussions. You know, I mean, we haven't gotten into the question of, you know, the social drinking and whether or not a little is wrong inherently, or whether there's a wisdom factor. But I mean, what is interesting about this is Peter talks primarily about the reaction of the Gentiles to your behavior. They're surprised. They're surprised you don't want to have fun with them anymore. You don't want to go drinking with the boys anymore. Why is that? Well, because you've been transformed by something. And what's interesting to me is his use of this term surprise in this passage. In verse 4, they're surprised at you. But verse 12, do not be surprised at what's going to happen. Don't be surprised at the ordeal that's coming on you. Don't be surprised when you suffer. You know, the world will be surprised at the behavior of Christians, but Christians should not be surprised at the behavior of the world, because we knew it in advance that it was coming.
Right.
And we you know, don't you know, don't be fooled. Don't be surprised. Make other people surprised at you, for a good reason.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Mike.
No, I'm saying Wayne's exactly right. We had participated in those worldly things, and now we've become righteous by obedience to the gospel. Who better to know why that's wrong? And now we end up teaching not by words, because they're not going to listen to us. You teach by the example.
Okay.
You know, whoever it was that said, I'd rather see a sermon than hear one any day, was very right.
Yeah. So it sounds like from what Wayne was saying a while ago, and I saw how he threw in there the subject we may or may not discuss. The point behind Peter's
I'm trying to
statement-
prod you into discussing it, but
yeah. The point behind Peter's statement here isn't dealing with a singular sin. It's dealing with not walking a lifestyle where you are in pursuit of the passions of the flesh and therefore run to the same level that the people of the world are running.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, the goal is not to fit in. I mean, there's a sense in which we become all things to all men for the
Right.
sake of the gospel, but then there's a sense in which we don't become the world. We are in the world. There's no escaping that, but never become of the world.
We
And I
put
think
the
that that's
will
what
of
Peter-
God above the world.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, and I mean, I think that that's just the bottom line in all of this is even though you're living in the world, you're living this time in the flesh. You're not living it for the lusts of the flesh, the lusts of men. You're living it for the will of God.
And we don't worry about what
And,
they say. They're going to be judged by God, just as we're going to be judged by God. Yeah. Go ahead, Eric.
Some of you probably know this better than me, but I've read in passing in other places that it was not uncommon, even in the philosophers of the day, to have these sort of lists of immoral behavior, and that a lot of these things were even frowned on by, upstanding Greeks. These same kinds of things were seen as immoral and to some degree, right? Am I right about that?
Yeah, vice lists were a thing in the ancient world.
And didn't Augustine?
Just one of those? Is this a vice
I mean,
list?
it's the vice. There's a lot of vice lists in the New Testament. I mean, you could
Right.
say that Galatians 5, Romans 1. I made a catalog of a bunch of all the different places they appear once, but I forget where I put it.
Right. 1 Timothy.
Okay. This looks interesting. Vice lists and non-Pauline sources. Apparently, well, the Old Testament contains vice lists too. I mean, so you've got that. Although it's more the law criticizing things and the prophets bashing on things. I mean, vice lists are very common.
I mean, Augustine, didn't he do that in some of his writings of
No.
sorts?
Probably. I'm not as
Sort of.
familiar with Augustine, but
Yeah. At least he's been credited for certain lists, what constitute what and everything.
yeah.
I
mean, it wasn't even just a Greco-Roman thing. It appears to have been a Jewish thing
Yeah.
as well.
So they clearly understood what was wrong behavior, what was out of control behavior, what was detrimental behavior.
Well, I think
And
everybody,
people
every
today
culture.
People today sort of frown on
Right.
drunkenness. Even people who don't. I don't know. It's weird. They kind of have a mixed feeling about it, but it's
They use the
generally
phrase, "drink
seen as a
responsibly."
shameful thing if you go to an office party and somebody's just
Out of control.
out of control. Even worldly people see that as something that's sort of shameful.
Well,
Yeah, I
I
saw
mean,
My dad did
every
trouble one
every
time.
culture has those vices, those ethical lines that they refuse to cross. Sometimes they're not really based on anything other than just cultural mores, which is why we live in a world where, I mean, a man marrying a man is considered okay, but a man sleeping with a 17-year-old girl is considered outrageous. So I mean, culture is very selective about what the things it says are and are not wrong. It's if a man is a serial. If a man sleeps with 50 different women, that's considered okay, fine, whatever. But if a man marries 2 women and tries to support them financially, that's considered repressive. So I mean, culture makes up its own ethical rules as it goes along, and makes up its own vices.
But I do think that there is something to the idea to say that a lot of times the things that we find are sin in the scriptures, society does recognize are counterproductive to society. Intoxication is a counterproductive thing to society, and while most people in society participate in it, there's still a generic recognition of the danger that it poses to society. So I think you're exactly right. That there's a lot of times where society itself, and I believe even in Greek society, there was. I'm trying to remember the book about the Greek writing about the wedding feast, or it was a symposium, it was a drinking party, and they were talking about how embarrassing it was when the host became intoxicated, and this Greek philosophy of nothing in excess was their mantra towards these things.
Mm-hmm.
I need to clarify something I said because I jumped in there a little bit too soon. Eric talked about the office party, and I said something my dad got in trouble for. I could leave the wrong impression. When I was a kid, we went to one of my dad's office parties. He was a mechanic, and so the dealership threw a party there. And this woman, right as we were leaving, this woman walked up and she said, "Bye, MG," and gave me a little kiss on the cheek. Well, she was tipsy. And it was an interesting car ride home with my mom in the car as she had witnessed that event. And my dad's trying to tell her that that's not a common occurrence. She just had a little bit too much to drink. She's a little bit too friendly. And my point is the world recognizes when certain things like that are inappropriate as well. Going back to what y'all were saying there. But I had to finish that because someone watching this sounds like I just threw my dad under the bus for something that wasn't his fault at all.
I mean, it is interesting, even, I guess, the double standards that the world has. Because on the one hand, we recognize these things as bad. They recognize these things as bad, but on the other hand, they still chase them and they still embrace them.
Right.
In ridiculous ways, which is why you can have an office party where people can get a little bit inebriated, but that same office manager will fire people for posting drunk pictures of themselves on Facebook. I mean, you tell me who's consistent here.
I worked in the county, the prosecutor's office in Arizona years ago, and one of the things that was interesting was talking about prosecuting DUIs, and it struck in my mind because one of the attorneys speaking, he was actually Mormon and wasn't a drinker. But he made the comment to say, here we are prosecuting people for DUI, and he looked at the audience of the attorneys that were present. He says, and how many of you have not done that very thing but got away with it? And of course, there was a lot of people looking at their shoes at that moment, and I was struck by thinking, really, that many people are on the one hand prepared to send somebody to jail for the very thing that they themselves have gotten away with.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow, that's amazing.
And so they are surprised when we don't, and especially if we used to run with them and we stop, they're surprised at our decision.
John, that seems to be the contrast that's being made there in verses 3 and 4. You spend enough time doing this, and even people who you used to be associated with or used to do these things with, they're surprised, and as Wayne pointed out, they speak evil of you, or they say bad things about you because of that. But what it shows is that when one becomes a Christian, there has to be this tremendous contrast that takes place, this complete change of what we're willing to do, and he's reminding them of that. That's in your past. Don't go back to your past. Don't dig that up. You spend enough time doing that. Now, even those who are in your community, they look at you and think, wow, what's the deal with him? That he won't do these same things anymore. And I think it just really a great lesson for us is to see this great change that is to take place. One of the things that we learn is that those voids have to be filled. And it's really easy when you rip all those things out that he lists there, the lewdness and the lust and the drunkenness, the revelries, the drinking parties, the idolatries. You rip those out of your life. If you just leave a cavernous hole there where that used to be, it's very easy to jump right back in. But if you fill those up with some very good things, good associations, good friends, good habits, then it's not as easy to go back in that direction.
Good point. Good point. All right. Any other thoughts or comments on verses 1 through 5?
I mean, I guess that, when we're talking about surprise, of course, the reason it's surprising to them is because they don't understand your calling. They don't understand the Christ that you follow. Which is why you're supposed to give a defense. You're supposed to make apology for the hope that is within you, for anyone who asks you to give an account for it. But the reverse, those who know your calling in Christ, who understand what it means to be in Christ, you shouldn't be perhaps so surprising to them. Now you have a different problem.
Right.
People who know what you're supposed to be defining your life by and then see you living inconsistently with that calling, now they have reason to be surprised. And that's not the good kind of surprise. Right. So make sure you're surprising the right people, I guess. That could be a sermon. Oh.
One is it also possible, although this I don't think the context really identifies it, but there are some times that you will, by overcoming these things that he's listed here, you will accomplish something that maybe some of your friends desire to overcome but are unable to. And maybe there's a bit of jealousy there when they look at what you have obtained, and yet they themselves struggle with it, know they want to leave it, but yet, for whatever reason, they don't. That could be a possible source of the maligning as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, for the gospel has for this purpose been preached even to those who are dead, that though they are judged in the flesh as men, they may live in the spirit according to the will of God. And this happened according to 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 18. When? No, I'm kidding. What's he talking about here when he says the has been preached even to those who are dead? My thought's always been spiritually dead. That's why we preach the gospel to those who are spiritually dead.
See, I have a totally different take on that. I mean, I think that, it's a parenthetical comment.
Okay.
When he says, based off of what he said in verse 5, they're going to give an account to him who is ready to judge the living and the dead.
Okay, all right.
Verse 6, the gospel has been preached to those who are dead, that though they are judged in the flesh as men, they may live in the spirit according to the will of God. Who are these people? These people, he says, have been judged in the flesh, but they live in the spirit, which, if we take that in parallel to 3:18, which I think we should, we're looking at being put to death in the flesh, made alive in the spirit, once again. Well, who's been put to death and made alive in the spirit? Besides Jesus. You might say Christians who have died or been persecuted or something like that.
1 Thessalonians 4.
Right. So I take verse 6 to be a reference to Christians who have physically died. They've heard the gospel, they've accepted it, and though they were condemned in the flesh as men, they live in the spirit. They're the ones who will be vindicated, not the Gentiles who are maligning them, but those who stayed fast to the sufferings of Christ. So that's how I've been reading it anyway.
Yeah, me too. I see it that way too.
But I admit it's a difficult verse.
I'm kidding. I think that's a very good point. Any other thoughts on that? I think it's a very good explanation of that. And one I really hadn't looked at with that clarity, and I need to go back and kind of rethink about that. Because if we're not careful, someone could attempt to twist it and say that Jesus went preached to the dead,
right,
so they had the second chance, as we talked about with the letter.
It's a favorite proof text to people who hold to a second chance view of verse 19 of chapter 3.
Yeah. But if we view those those faithful who have already died, the gospel was preached to them so that they could live in the spirit according to the will of God. Mm-hmm. It talks about their obedience to the gospel's call, 1 Thessalonians 4.
Right.
Yeah.
So I just take it to be more of the same: condemned by the flesh, vindicated by the spirit.
Okay.
Which it fits with the whole story of 2 Peter. Suffering comes first, then glory. Yeah.
Any thoughts? Other thoughts?
I was reading. I suppose it's probably a paraphrase version. It's called expanded translation about this, and talking about the dead there, it says the now dead, they were preached to when they were alive. Now they have passed. They passed away.
Physical dead. All right.
I'm curious.
Okay.
Well, and it's interesting. Verse 5, he says the living and the dead. So unless he switches gears, that does make sense. I wouldn't have thought of it that way either, but you guys make a good case for it.
Well, the footnote in the Net Bible agrees with my view. In context, the phrase "those who are dead" refers to those now dead who had accepted the gospel while they were still living and had suffered persecution for their faith. They suffered judgment in this earthly life. They died in the midst of physical abuse from the ungodly. They will enjoy life from God in the spiritual heavenly realm because of the gospel. It clearly does not assume a second chance for conversion offered to unbelievers who died. Why would Peter urge people to suffer in this life for the sake of the gospel if he believed that mercy would be extended to all death in the hereafter? That's a good point. Oh.
Good reason, yeah.
I had leaned toward the spiritually dead, although you guys may be right. I think about, but certainly we can show from other passages that even for those who are rebelling, it is the Lord's will that they hear the message because they will be judged, and He wants them to hear. As He tells, I believe it's Ezekiel, they will say, or they will know that there's been a prophet, that they have heard the message. So that kind of fits as well, that they would give the opportunity to repent. Because He's saying the hard part to me to tie in is He said, "This is why." Well, what is why? He had just said because they're going to answer. Who's going to answer? Those who are making fun of you now are going to one day answer for that. And then how does that connect to this is why the gospel was preached to even those who are dead, unless it includes the those who had maligned you. I don't know.
Yeah.
Well,
I mean, like I said, I take verse 6 as parenthetical.
But it says this is why.
Yeah.
Yeah.
For the gospel has for this purpose been. Yeah, I guess it's. I mean, it's very
if the gospel
strange.
has not been preached to all people, then all people cannot be accountable. And so, verse 6, though parenthetical, is simply proving verse 5: all people stand accountable.
I'm looking at it here. For this purpose, also the gospel has been preached, in order that though they are as in the flesh as men, they might live in the spirit according to God. Which, I mean, maybe it could be that the "why" refers to the latter clause in verse 6. It reads awkwardly in English, but this says basically the reason that the gospel has been preached to those currently dead is so that they can live in the spirit according to the will of God. That's the whole reason we're preaching the gospel, is to give life to those who are judged in the flesh as men. I mean, that's a way to read it as well.
Okay. Couple of thoughts here for just a moment. The one thing about Eric, what we were talking about there regarding being spiritual dead is, depending on how you do read it, has been preached even to those who are dead, jump ahead, that they may live in the spirit according to the will of God. And that does sound a lot like Ephesians, where he talks about we who are once dead in trespasses and sins, He has made alive with Christ. It sounds a lot like that. But I do kind of see the other side, going from ready to judge the living and the dead. Let's talk about them for a little bit longer in verse 6, and then we'll get to verse 7, the end of all things. I kind of see it both ways, or it could be both ways. Yeah. Brian, the passage you dropped in the chat room, I talked about that Sunday night, and initially I was going to use it in the context that you referenced it in regards to the repentance, and whoever, I think maybe Paul was talking about that, when we rid ourselves of sin, we've got to put something in the place of it there. But I ended up going a little bit different direction, holding, I think, to the context, and that is, he's talking about the Pharisees. If they were unwilling to believe and accept Christ, then their end would be worse than the beginning. But I do think that is an interesting application of showing, we need to put something good there, or else it's going to be worse off.
We see that multiple. Oh, go ahead, Brian. I'm sorry.
I was going to say just what Paul said. That was what brought that to my mind. So go ahead, Paul.
We see that multiple times in scriptures. We see the fruit of the Spirit, the works of the flesh, contrasted. Other passages, lay aside these things, be filled with these things. In the epistles, we see that frequently. When there's a list of things that we have to rip out of our lives, there's sometimes also a list of things to fill up. Is all I was going to say. Yeah.
And that's for those who may be watching this later. Brian had pasted into the chat room Matthew 12:43 through 45 about the unclean spirit goes out of a man, and then comes back to the man later and finds a place swept and clean, and 7 other spirits more wicked than himself goes in. The end is worse than the beginning, and he's talking about, of course, that generation, obviously.
Another good passage. It actually applies straight to what we're talking about here in 1 Peter 4 is Ephesians 5:18. Again, a contrast of being filled with one thing or the other. Don't be drunk with wine, which is dissipation. Be filled with the Spirit.
Yeah.
Again, it just seems very clear that the Bible constantly wants us, and I don't disagree with you, John, that Matthew 12 might be a contextually something different, but generally speaking, we want to understand that a person can't just remove these things from his life. He has to remove these things from his life, and then he has to fill himself with spiritual things. Otherwise, nature abhors a vacuum. The spiritual nature does too.
Yeah, I agree.
Don't be filled with spirits. Be filled with the Spirit.
Oh.
All right. Speaking of spirits, do we want to talk for just a moment about what Wayne kind of I'm throwing Wayne under the bus on this one if we end up talking about it. Let me clarify. I have myself used the drinking party reference as scriptural text showing that as Christians, even one drink we should stay away from. One alcoholic drink we should stay away from. And I had a brother one time take issue with me in that he wasn't so sure that Peter's point there was about the Christian who may feel that it's okay to drink one drink occasionally, but about the Christian who's running the riotous behavior, which involved alcohol. And I don't think it's really I don't think it's a discussion we can resolve, since we're even overtime in this discussion. But that is kind of the question. Where does that one drink occasionally fit within this particular passage, or does it even?
John,
go ahead.
To me, the question would be, so you read this list, and one thing that doesn't fit in there to me would be their mealtime food and drink. And so if you want to find passages that would address what someone could have with their meal as they're sitting, and eating with their family, whatever, that's not what this verse is describing. We would need to bring in principles from other places to answer that question. But I think it's an abuse of patos, or this drinking parties, to say that if I sit down to supper, and if I had fermented wine, that's a patos now, or that's a drinking party. It clearly is not. So I think we would have to go elsewhere to answer that. In my opinion, that's not what Peter's describing here.
I mean,
there's much better arguments against that kind of thing than reliance on a single Greek word that only appears one time in the New Testament, and frankly, it doesn't have. I don't know. I would just be very careful if you're hanging your entire argument on one word and you've got no other supporting points to bring forth. I would be careful with that.
I think one word would be enough.
If you had certainty.
Yeah, right. In other words, I think if the Holy Spirit reveals it one time, that's sufficient. I don't want to say.
Well, no. I mean, something's true. Obviously, something's true if the Spirit only reveals it once.
Right.
But the problem is that when you don't have a lot of data to go on as far as the meaning of a word, and you're going to hang. I mean, the argument that I hear from Patos is. The argument that I've heard brethren make is very etymological, which to me runs afoul of all kinds of exegetical fallacies that people aren't supposed to commit in word studies. But I mean, you would be much better if you wanted to make a case against social drinking today. I think we would be much better served to make an argument from wisdom and to say, because I think you can make a very strong case that it's not wise.
Sure.
And in this day and age, especially with all of the stigma that's attached to it, with all of the cultural changes that have happened, frankly, I mean, if you can use culture to say that something like the holy kiss isn't binding today, you can also use culture in reverse fashion to say, well, maybe something is dangerous today that wasn't dangerous back then. So, I mean, those are just ideas to think about.
I would probably take a much more restrictive view than some on this in this study about alcohol, but I just don't see that here at 7 past the hour that we can get into that today. There might be a good time for a topical study when we're in between books or something to talk about whether it's okay to engage in recreational drinking. I do not believe it is, but we could discuss that.
Well, more I think the question isn't so much whether that's right or wrong, but if the context of Peter's statement here about living for the human passions, if the warnings there and telling them not to walk with Gentiles would include the rarely occasional drink, if that's what he's speaking to. And I'm like you. I teach, don't even drink one. Just
No.
stay away from it. And I think there are scriptural passages that would lead us as Christians to see the wisdom in that.
I think we're
this passage though. That's kind of the question.
right. I think we're assuming that everyone in this study is by practice a teetotaler, even if the reasons we do it are not necessarily the same across the board.
And I think again, terminology is going to be a key thing, because even if we say social drinking or recreational drinking, that might be what Peter's actually talking about by a drinking party, which was just getting together to drink, which is not something that belongs in the practice of a Christian.
Exactly.
But I don't know that those are fair descriptions for the family in Italy or wherever. That's what they have with their meal. Is that social drinking or recreational drinking, or is that just their mealtime beverage? And I think that it deserves a more thorough discussion, as Paul mentioned, and we probably don't have time for it today.
No, it does.
I don't think anyone here is trying to justify it either. We're talking, can this text be used for that?
No.
There are other, Go ahead.
But I think it comes down to a wisdom thing. Again, there's just so many reasons. There's so many reasons not to, and I have a hard time coming up with even one reason to engage in it today. So, that's just, to me that's the bottom line in the end. And I realize there's probably people could make similar arguments, and they'd be like, well, you should be less of a glutton than you are, Wayne, or you should do this less, Wayne, or something. Maybe, and maybe that's something I need to think about. But as far as the judgment calls that I've made for myself and the destructive behavior that you see alcohol cause in people, it's better for me. It's better for me as a preacher of the gospel, as someone who's trying to bring others to Christ. It's better in my judgment to just stay away.
Yeah. That's just we're not trying to talk about whether or not it is okay. We're talking about, does Peter address that scenario in this text here?
Right.
We're not talking about the other Bible passages and wisdom that we could.
Right, and you see, that to me is a different issue. The reason I arrived at that judgment was not because of what it said in 1 Peter 4, verse 3.
Right.
It would not be the passage I would instantly jump to either.
Yeah. Brian, you looked like you were going to say something too.
I was just going to say it's an important topic, but we might want to pick it up next week.
Yeah, definitely. I will. Now, this may get me in trouble. I will confess to drinking a little bit. The alcohol. I've got this little container about this big, and it's plastic, and it has a 2 tablespoon marking on it. And if I'm really, really sick, I'll pour a little bit of NyQuil in there and drink it. And I've tried the non-alcoholic stuff. I don't get well as fast with that stuff. It's, but it's okay. It's medicinal. So we got to keep that in mind.
I think I saw that on the Baldwin or on the Waltons or the Baldwin sisters once.
We did have a member, bless her heart, years ago. I knew, and she's a sweet little old lady, but I'd got the whole drainage thing and lost my voice, and she said, you need to drink a little whiskey with honey and lemon in it. And I said, and I called her by name, I said, I can't go buy whiskey for that purpose. And she says, oh, I do it all the time. If I'm sick, I'll go buy a bottle. I said, I'm sorry, I can't go into the liquor store and buy a bottle of whiskey. No matter how much it may help me get better, I'll just stick with NyQuil because everybody accepts that. So. Anyway, let's see. Let's plan next week to pick up with verse 7. The end of all things is at hand. How does that sound? The end of all things.
We're going to get to the end of all things. Does that include the end of all the study?
Well, we'll start the end at the beginning. How about that? The end of all things and the beginning of all things next week.
All right.
Now listen, we are talking about factoring the truth of God's word into our daily lives, and the reason why I was kind of continuing to hammer a little bit on this point about what Peter was saying here, we need to recognize and understand that there is a level that if we let ourselves get to and following the way of the world, we become to a point to where we're trying to fulfill the passions of the world. We get caught up in the lust of the world. We get caught up in the excitement that we see within the world. Love not the world, neither things that are in the world. 1 John 2:15 15 and following there talks about. And I really believe that many Christians are lost or find themselves lost because they begin to seek the fulfillment of the human passions and not the will of God. And that's really the point in my understanding to drive home from this particular section, that we have left those things behind. Even if you became a Christian when you were 15 years old, that's a lifestyle. Even if you never lived it, you still left behind. And our pursuit is to do the will of God and not fulfill the passions of the flesh. Any thoughts or any comments? All right. Well, any final word real quick here because we're over time. Brian, let's start with you.
Drinking is a really important issue, and this is a very important passage that probably speaks to the majority of the drinking problems, spiritual drinking issues that apply to people today. So that while we might have here at the end of the show mentioned that there are some things that aren't addressed here, this is a very important statement about the way our world looks at drinking and how it impacts lives. And so I think it's important for us to keep this passage referenced in our minds and understand what the Holy Spirit has revealed to us on this.
I think that's a very good point. A very good point to keep in mind. Yeah. Eric, any thoughts?
I want to say I agree with Brian on that. If you were to look at when people talk about drinking, that it's probably the kind of thing that Peter has in mind here is what he's describing. It would cover most of the issues that comes up, and so we definitely need to recognize the scene that he's portraying and see that as something that Christians are supposed to leave behind.
Yeah, that's a good point. Mr. Mike, any thoughts?
Church of Christ.
Okay.
All right.
Well, that's a thought.
Tom, any final thoughts or comments?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting after all the conversation. Our end discussion is on this one word. I totally agree. Our best approach is to deal with the idea of wisdom, and also I just think in our society, it's just not necessary. So I mean I would just simply leave it at that. There's enough alternatives that it's just not necessary. But as always, appreciate the study and look forward to moving ahead.
Okay, and Paul?
Just wanted to mention, if I could, that we have a gospel meeting Friday, Saturday, Sunday. If you're in South Central Indiana and happen to be watching this, that's August 26th through the 28th. And if you like to come out, we'll have services Friday night and Saturday night at 7 o'clock, and then on Sunday at 9:45, 10:30, and then 2:30 in the afternoon. And Gary Fisher will be here for a gospel meeting. And
Oh, good.
just letting you know you're welcome.
All right, appreciate that. And Wayne?
Once again, I'm grateful to have been here today and participate in the study with you all. It's always enjoyable, always a pleasure to study the Scriptures with like-minded Christians.
All righty. All right. Well, that brings us to the end of our study. Wait, breaking news, hot off the press. No, not for you. Never mind. Thanks, Dale. Appreciate everyone joining us for our study today. We'll plan, Lord willing, continue this subject, 1 Peter 4, verse 7, next Wednesday at 11 o'clock a.m. Central Time.
That's noon if you're in the Eastern Time Zone.
9 a.m. Pacific Time.
10 a.m. Mountain Time.
If you're in Ulaanbaatar, Mongolia, 1 a.m.
Right here at live.truthfactor.com. Have a wonderful week.